Well, after almost a year of waiting for it, we finally have Clair Obscur Expedition 33. While I'm assuming that this game flew under the radar of a lot of people who weren't really in the know, I had been looking forward to this one ever since its announcement at the June 2024 Xbox Showcase. And truth be told, I remember at the time thinking out of all the games shown in this event, this was really the only game that I had any interest in actually playing. So when I saw them announce a turn-based RPG with a realistic art style that was actually made by a French developer, my eyebrows were certainly raised. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm not really a big fan of Western video games. I honestly can't even think of the last big Western release that I was looking forward to. And I'm pretty sure the last non-indie Western game that I bought was Cyberpunk, and yeah, we all know how that one turned out. So going into Expedition 33, I would say I was skeptical to say the very least. Even leading up to the days before release, I just kept thinking in my head, man, there's gonna be something. They're gonna mess this up somehow. They're gonna blow it up in some way. There's no way that this is gonna come out and be actually great. And I'm at least happy to say I was wrong, that the game did turn out to be pretty good. Pretty great, even. But if you've been following gaming news, you already knew this. Every single person and their mother is singing this game's praises, and while I will be doing some of that, I haven't really heard anybody dig into any of the criticisms of the game that it rightfully deserves. This isn't a perfect game. It's a great game, probably one of the better RPGs I've played in a while, but this isn't some golden masterpiece that triumphs over the entire gaming industry and is the best RPG in 20 years like some people will claim it is. It's pretty good. It might even be my game of the year. It certainly is my game of the year so far. But it's also not without its flaws, so I'm going to be breaking down the various aspects of the game, what I liked, what I didn't like, and just kind of my general thoughts on it. I won't be going into any spoilers until the spoiler section of the story section, and I won't use any footage of the game outside of Act 1 until we get to the spoiler section of the story. So without further ado, here's my thoughts on Clair Obscur Expedition 33. Starting off with the gameplay, Expedition 33 is a relatively traditional turn-based RPG in the style of classic Japanese role-playing games. Think something along the lines of a Persona or a Final Fantasy. And in this variation on that classic theme, this game allows you to have 3 party members out at any given time during a battle, and features a turn order system where you can see in the corner the order of which your party members or the enemies will go. The game also has unique mechanics for every party member in the game. It really made every character feel unique in combat. I know there's plenty of games of this sort where some of the characters feel kinda samey, especially once you start being able to give every character in your party similar or the same abilities. And in this game, it does have an ability transfer system known as the Pictos system. This allows you to equip up to 3 skills for every party member. However, once those skills have been fully learned, you can actually transfer those skills to other party members in the Lumina system. It sounds a little complicated, and at first it seems a bit overwhelming, but it's really not. It's quite a simple system. It reminded me a lot of how skills were learned in the game Lost Odyssey. I wouldn't be surprised if that was directly the influence that led to that mechanic. Actually, this game seems to wear a lot of its influences on its sleeve. The real-time, quick-time events that you have to perform during combat remind me a lot of the ones from the Paper Mario games or Shadow Hearts. These ones felt relatively easy to perform, and I very rarely missed the timing on them. However, when it comes to the parrying and blocking system, we start to hit one of my first critiques of the game. This game suffers from a terrible case of what I like to call Elden Ring syndrome. It seems like almost every enemy in the game has these sort of delayed attacks, where the swing is so long it exists for no reason other than to catch you and have you block or dodge early. This forces you to not so much react to what the enemy is doing, but learn the specific patterns of their moveset. There's a sort of trial and error to it, and it adds a layer of artificial difficulty to the combat. I'm not complaining that the game is too hard or anything. I found the difficulty to be just right on expedition or difficulty throughout the game. This is just more of a critique of the gameplay design. Like I said, it doesn't even really make the game harder. It just makes it so that you don't know when to block the first time you fight that specific enemy. Once you have the timing down, it's kind of pointless that it even was delayed in the first place. Outside of the combat, there's also traversal through two different types of environments. These would be the overworld environments that allow you to go between different areas, and the actual areas themselves, which are functionally dungeons within this game. And in these dungeons, you're basically going through glorified hallways with a few branching paths for exploration. However, because the visual design for a lot of these areas is relatively samey throughout them, I would sometimes find myself getting lost or walking around in circles, unable to find where I'm supposed to go. I understand this is probably a me issue more than anything, but I just can't help but feel that the game could have benefited from some type of dungeon map or something along those lines, just so that you can see where you're going and also see where you haven't been. And that takes us to the next aspect of the game I'd like to discuss, the visuals. I will say, visually, it is a pretty good-looking game. While some of the environments can at times look a little generic, when the art style flourishes, it looks quite nice. Especially in some later sections of the game, which I'll include footage of them in the spoiler section, but take my word for it that some of the later areas are some of the nicer looking ones. On the other side of the visuals would be the character designs, and for the most part I thought they were fine. None of the human characters had particularly flashy designs, but I did enjoy how they looked. Nobody looked bad. It was just all of the main cast wear essentially variations on the same uniform. So everybody had, again, relatively realistic hair color and hairstyle. You know, this isn't an anime game, so nobody had any sort of crazy designs, I'd say. As far as non-human characters, I quite liked the designs of the Gestrels, these sort of paintbrush wooden model characters. I also thought the game did a good job with enemy variety and found that consistently throughout the game you were fighting different enemies. The game didn't really reuse any enemy types until the later portions of the game. It's not uncommon for games like this to have you fighting essentially recolored enemies before even the end of the first third of the game. So I appreciated that, again, it was unique enemies for quite some time through the game. There are a few times in the visuals where you can tell this is a smaller scale game, especially in the opening of the game where you see various NPCs milling about, and you'll see the same NPC copied and pasted all next to each other 3-4 times. It looks kind of silly, but again, this is kind of a crowd shot that you're just walking through. But I would be lying if I said it wasn't distracting to see the same man in the green suit just standing there, talking to himself. Personally, I'm not a really big graphics guy. That's never been something that's a make or break deal for me in a game, so it's passable, and at times quite beautiful. However, where I'm kind of more of a stickler is in performance. And I will say, the game on PlayStation 5, where I played it, is pretty well optimized. I didn't really notice any particular frame drops or hiccups with the performance. I'll also add, as a little bit of an aside, my close friend and regular co-host on this channel, the Golden Rat, has been playing through the game on his Steam Deck, and while visually it wouldn't look as good as the PlayStation 5 version, he's stated it's pretty playable, which a lot of the Unreal Engine 5 games have had some issues on Steam Deck, so the fact that it's optimized to play on that handheld shows me that it is pretty optimized across the board. I'm also pleased to say that I didn't run into any bugs or glitches throughout my entire playthrough. But that's essentially all I have to say about the visuals. And that takes us to the part of the game that I feel like I have the most praise for, and that would be the music. The music of the game is probably the one aspect that I likely would refer to as perfection, or at least as close to it as a video game soundtrack can be. There's actually a staggering amount of music in this game. The official release of the soundtrack is listed at 154 songs, clocking over 8 hours. However, that doesn't even include some songs within the game. There's actually songs that are left off of the official release of the soundtrack that are in the game. Crazier yet, the composer for the game, and forgive me for butchering this name, Lorien Testard, was somebody that the developers actually contacted through a form, according to an interview. He was a freelance composer who'd never even worked on a video game soundtrack before, which certainly could have fooled me. This is a OST to rival a lot of the RPG greats. I would certainly put a lot of the compositions on here up with some of the ones in games like Final Fantasy or even some of the Xeno series. There's excellent use of leitmotifs throughout the entire soundtrack, and for those of you that don't know, a leitmotif is basically when you take a theme or melody and reuse it in a different context, usually to represent a character or a place or an emotion. However, what really sells the soundtrack to me is the fact that the entire soundtrack is scored by a live band. There's been plenty of great game soundtracks that have relied on synthesized instruments, and as synthesized instruments have gotten better over the years, it's become a little less noticeable. But the human touch of hearing live bass, live orchestration, it gives it a much more organic feel than if it were all digitally programmed instruments. I guess you could say it adds a certain je ne sais quoi.
Oui, oui. C'est l'histoire du berger!
Which isn't to say that there's no programming or synthesizers in the soundtrack, just that a majority of the tracks do use live instrumentation. It's honestly the parts where the game kind of leans into some of the more synthesized, inorganic elements that it really starts to stick out. One of my favorite tracks from the game that emphasizes this would be the Lampmaster boss at the end of Act 1. It keeps a very organic classical sound, but it chops it up and puts it in a very inorganic way. It really fits the boss quite well. It also features a sample of a drum fill, which is the only time drums are used throughout the song. And it also uses that drum fill at the start of the second phase of the fight. It's honestly just really well used music throughout. However, unfortunately, this leads to one of my actually biggest problems with the game, and it's easily one of the most glaring issues, at least throughout my playthrough, was the horrible audio balancing. Outside of combat, the ambient sounds and music are pretty quiet, though once you enter combat, it becomes extremely loud.
Spill some ink.
I found myself having to turn the volume up on my headphone amplifier when outside of combat, but then as soon as I enter a battle, having to turn it down to avoid blowing my eardrums out. I couldn't find anything in the settings to affect this, so the only thing I can hope for is that they can fix this in a future patch or something.
I'm having a lot of fun with you. Me too. It's so fun, I don't even mind the too loud French radio.
And with that, we can finally move on to the story portion of the game. And like I said, I will be going full into spoiler territory during this section. So if you don't want to be spoiled on the story, and I definitely recommend that you don't get spoiled if you haven't played it yet, go ahead and skip to the timestamp that I'm putting on screen right now. While I'm not going to do a full play-by-play of the entire story, I will be going into a few of the main points and my thoughts on some of them. The main plot of the game is that there's a figure known as the Paintress who every year paints a number on a large monolith, and every year paints an increasingly lowered number by 1 year. Once that number is painted, anybody of that age instantly dies in a process known as the gourmage. In order to attempt to stop her, every year there's a team of expeditioners who go out and try to stop the Paintress, to attempt to prevent her from doing this annual process. We find out in the game that this process started when the number was 100, and at the current time in the game, the number has just hit 33. Shortly after, the main expedition team gets together and sets off, and I was initially a little confused watching the scene play out, as in all of the trailers leading up to release, we only ever saw the main party members of the expedition, and never saw any other expeditioners as NPCs or even party members. And it turns out it's because as soon as the expedition lands on the island that they need to be on, they're immediately attacked by a mysterious old man, somehow old enough to escape the effects of the gourmage, who then brutally murders all of the expeditioners. And the ones that don't get brutally murdered by him end up getting killed by monsters. However, we have nothing to worry about, as our boy Gustav clearly has the power of plot armor on his side, and surely will have it for the remainder of the game. From here, the story mostly consists of our boy Gustav going around and gathering up what remains of his expedition into a party of adventurers, so that they can hopefully go and defeat the Paintress, and maybe somewhere along the way, figure out the mystery of the old man. Along the way, they meet a mythical being by the name of Esquier, who is willing to help them travel to where they need to go, but on the condition that they assist him in finding some of his missing rocks. This leads the party to going to a cliffside area where apparently one of the rocks are, and the party unfortunately gets ambushed by the old man. And when I say the party, most of the party escapes unscathed. It's specifically Gustav who faces off against the old man. This culminates in the classic RPG supposed to lose type fight, where Gustav very quickly realizes he's not the guy. And in a moment that honestly completely blindsided me, our lead protagonist Gustav is killed by the old man. And it was at this point that I thought there had to be some kind of fake out or something. I guess I got used to Metaphori Fantasio, where deaths meant nothing and characters would just come back from the dead multiple times, but no, that was the end for Gustav, our protagonist for the game. This was really a moment that completely took me by surprise, because there was nothing in any of the marketing, none of the trailers. They really did a good job of hiding this, and considering that I got to this moment basically the day of release, I wasn't spoiled or anything. I was completely blindsided by this. And it is at this moment that we are introduced to the real protagonist of the game. Yes, it was all a fake out. Gustav was not the protagonist. Our new real protagonist of the game, for the remainder of the game, a character by the name of Verso. Verso is voiced by Ben Starr, and honestly, I'm getting a little tired of hearing Ben Starr in games now. He was pretty great as Clive in Final Fantasy XVI, but it seems like he's kind of the on-call guy for every protagonist in every game. He does a pretty good job in the game, and all the voice acting in the game is pretty good. It's just one of those things that, I don't know, man, he's kind of becoming the new Troy Baker. But after heading back out on their adventure, giving Gustav a proper funeral, and then also picking up Best Boy Monoko in their party, the best party member and my personal favorite character in the game, we also, somewhere in all that, get the reveal that the old man character is not just any random old man. He's actually a character by the name of Renoir, who's the father of Verso. They were both part of the first expedition, But for some reason, Renoir ended up turning on them, and the rest is history that Verso seems to be a little hesitant to speak about, to say the least. Skipping ahead just a little, after getting 2 items from 2 different bosses on 2 different islands in order to make the ultimate sword to pierce through the Paintress's barrier, our team finally heads off to defeat her once and for all and end the cycle of the gommage. And after a long, drawn-out boss fight with the Paintress, she's finally defeated, and the day is saved. Roll credits, throw a big party, it's celebration time. We defeated the Paintress, the gommage is over. Except that is not how the game ends. As it turns out, after defeating the Paintress, it ends up actually gommaging everybody left on Lumiere. And to add just another twist in this pretzel of a story, it turns out that the world of Lumiere is not actually the real world. It turns out to be a painting, or I guess more accurately, a magical world located within a painting. The game doesn't fully deep dive into how it works, though your body stays in the real world and your mind enters the painting, but leaving your body in a vegetative state. While the game doesn't really go into if the canvas was always magical, it does reveal that there was some kind of house fire years ago, and the real-world version of Maëlle was badly burned, losing one eye and badly burning half her face, and being unable to speak after severely damaging her throat. Her brother, the real Verso, was killed in the fire. This led to her mother and father retreating deep into the painting world, her mother becoming the Paintress, and her father being, I guess, part of the first expedition. The game seems a little intentionally vague on some of the points in regards to how the real world and the fantasy world interact, and part of me almost wonders if it's set up for some kind of sequel or expansion. But after returning to the real world, Maëlle, who we find is actually named Alicia, decides to go back into the painting and wants to basically undo the damage that was done, bring everybody back. Her real-world life is a life of pain and suffering. She'd rather escape into the painting world and live in her happy world of fantasy. And after a final confrontation with Renoir, the game does something actually pretty interesting. Verso decides that he wants to actually remove his soul, the soul of his real self, from the painting. And the game actually gives you a choice of essentially 2 endings for the final boss fight. You can either play as Maëlle and defeat Verso, which gives you an ending where you stay in the painting and recreate everybody who was around from before the gommage, and even Gustav comes back. But now Verso's soul is trapped for eternity, and there's a sadness to that is very clearly present. It's not really portrayed as a good ending. Or you can pick to play as Verso in the final fight, and he actually does end the painting world, causing Maëlle to return to her real world, and the family actually ends up grieving for Verso and holding a funeral after all these years of living in denial of his death. It's a very bittersweet ending, but it definitely feels closer to the true ending of the game than the other one. I know I missed some details, but I've rambled on long enough about the story, and I kind of just wanted to get my thoughts in regards to how I felt about it and what I think about it. And I do have to say, I thought it was pretty good. I know I've seen some people complain about it being overly complicated and kind of pretentious, and in a way it is, but this is very clearly taking a lot of influence from Japanese role-playing games that very often have convoluted stories, so I guess I'm just used to them at that point. But I do have to say, I definitely liked the story this game told. It's honestly refreshing to play through a story that's not about really any political themes or social themes. It's really about 2 ideas. The idea of grief and how one copes with loss, especially the loss of a close family member, and escapism, especially as it relates to grief. The moral of the story that it really tries to tell is that coping with grief by using escapism isn't a healthy method of coping with it. And I found it quite interesting that, especially going back through some of my footage, that Renoir, in none of his dialogue, is really portrayed as a bad guy. He's an antagonist to Mael for sure, but nothing he says is incorrect, and especially if you choose the Verso ending, you kind of prove everything he says correct. He wasn't really a villain at all, but of course he wasn't a villain. He's your father, and he's not portrayed as being abusive or negative in any way. And one other little note, the game's ending certainly did have me crying just a little. I don't know, it could have just been raining in my room when I played the ending. I'm not entirely sure. But there is a very real chance that I was shedding some manly tears watching the final scene of the game. So, in conclusion, I'd say I really liked Clair Obscur Expedition 33. I'd recommend it to anybody who's a big fan of old school 3 dudes in a row RPGs. I definitely think people are overhyping it just a bit. Calling it the best RPG in the last 20 years, or even calling it the best turn-based RPG in the last 20 years, misses a lot of context, and I feel like that's such a reductive statement that kind of shows an ignorance to the genre. I certainly wouldn't go so far as to call the game a masterpiece. Again, it's a really good game, and at this current time, my favorite game of the year so far, and the way that the release schedule looks for the rest of the year, probably my favorite game for the whole year. But I feel like to call a game a masterpiece implies that there's no improvements that could be made, and I would hate for the fine folks at Sandfall Interactive to think that they've made the best game they could make. If anything, I certainly would hope they could get some feedback, some criticism, and make whatever they're making even better than this. Wouldn't it be incredible if their next game is better than Expedition 33? But that's my thoughts on the game. I would say if you have Game Pass, the game is available to play, so you should definitely check it out. And considering that the game launched for only $50, it's worth buying for full price. Though anyone a little more skeptical or maybe not as big of a fan of turn-based RPGs, you might want to wait for a sale on this one. I wouldn't be surprised if you see it for 15-20% off before the end of the year. But that's all I really have to say, so this has been Mega Rock'n'Rolla, reminding you to keep rockin'.
Baby, come here, bring it to me, wanna see what that body do. Baby, come here, bring it to me, we'll spend my night with you. Better believe it, beep, beep, get out of my way.